I am Nia Howard Fenton. I'm working as the Programs and Community Advocator at the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center, where we are working at the intersection of law, policy, and also serving the community in terms of environmental and climate justice. So we are a Westchester grassroots and environmental justice organization, and we're serving both on the ground, doing a lot of work in the community as well as at the table in terms of policy. And Raya sits on many different boards and councils where she is also making our voice heard. So we are focusing on this conversation nationally as well as internationally, which is why I'm so excited to bring tonight's discussion together about COP30. So we have a few different programs that we're doing, and you can find more about that on our website, which will share more information after the presentation. But we have youth programs that are focused on marine science education, and we're really trying to get our community in Westchester involved in conversations around coastal resilience and what that means for especially historically disadvantaged communities who have little to no access to the waterways in their communities, and also just awareness about what's in the water and what's going on. And we also have our Air of Truth program, which is our air quality community initiative. And we just installed our first air monitor in New Rochelle, New York. So we're very excited about that, and really trying again to get our community involved in these discussions around air quality and environmental injustices. So I will pass it on to Raya Salter, the executive director, to get us started this evening.
So thanks everybody for joining. Folks may, I think, continue to join, and we are recording this so that we can continue to share this. But really, we are a grassroots-based organization that does other advocacy. And since we're going to these United Nations COP discussions in Brazil, I wanted to really give folks in our local area let's just do a briefing so we can talk about this. And I'm only going to talk for a few minutes, and then I'm going to pass it to Anthony. Just a little bit of context. So what is COP? What is COP? The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, is a treaty that was adopted in 92 to address climate change. And the Conference of the Parties, or COP, is the annual meeting of all countries that are party to this agreement. So it's the decision-making body to negotiate, review, set goals, and create progress on addressing the climate crisis. From an advocate's perspective, it's a place where civil society can push for ambition, transparency, climate justice, and really hold governments to account. So that's just a bit about, what is COP. And next slide, please. I figured I would just literally just show a few slides for folks who maybe haven't been of what it actually looks like. I think there's a mouse that's going around on the on the pre-sub. This is a picture of a plenary from last year. I was not there in Baku. Next slide, please. This is just literally, this I think perhaps was Egypt. This is what the meeting itself looks like. Folks sitting in rows, folks from different countries, where the actual, plenaries and negotiations are taking place. Next slide, please. Here's an example. This was in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Again, just of what this. If folks could mute themselves, please, if you've joined. And Nia, I think you can also mute participants as the host. Just another demonstration of what it looks like in practice when folks are coming together in these discussions. Next slide, please. Here is an example. There's usually a lot of activity happening within the COP and outside the COP. There are different, nations have pavilions, NGOs have pavilions. Here, as an example of a pavilion where folks are, discussing particular issues, putting on programs and events from all over the world. Next slide, please. And this is kind of blurry, but what this is, I believe this is Glasgow. I was here. I know there are other folks who were there. This is a protester being carried off. And so this is also civil society showing up and demanding climate action is also a really important part of what the COPs are. Next slide, please. So very briefly, like what was this Paris Agreement? Where are we with this UNFCCC process? And so this was our big moment in 2015, where, the majority of countries made this agreement to make the commitments necessary to address the climate crisis, as science is telling us. Each country is supposed to make its own pledge or its nationally determined contribution to cut pollution. But emissions are still rising. We've blown past all those targets, as you'll hear later. This agreement, this Paris Agreement, actually, even if we followed it to the letter, it would not get us to where we need to be because we haven't done what we need to do. So there's a lot of problems with the implementation process. And as we're seeing, the climate crisis, every day we find out that there's a near and dear impact than we thought. Next slide, please. But what's at stake here in Brazil? This was finally supposed to be the People's COP. For the past several years, the COP has been located in petrostates. Egypt, Dubai, Baku, where not only, is a petrostate, fossil fuel interests literally controlling the process, but very limited ability to even to protest and for civil society to show up in any way. And so while folks are continuing, to participate, all the constituencies have been pointed towards COP30 in Brazil, an administration favorable to our cause, symbolically located in the Amazon, the lungs of the world that are being extracted from is having a real emergency there. And we've got major constituencies, in particular the indigenous constituencies, sending lots of people, planning major public interventions. So that's it was really supposed to be the People's COP. Logistically, it's become problematic. Belem, this gateway to the Amazon city, is small. It probably will not be able to accommodate all these people who have descended. There's been a scrum for housing, for badges. Will there be enough food for folks? So in some way, what is the footprint we're having on this, important area? So there's some challenges shaping up there that are disappointing, but it's still supposed to be the People's COP. You're going to hear a lot more from Anthony in detail on the pieces that are going to be in play. But this COP is supposed to be implementation mode. Are we actually creating more ambitious, nationally determined contributions in this idea of the global stocktake? Are we going to understand what these emissions are so we can grapple with them? And we continue to discuss climate finance. And this is for climate justice. This is particularly important for countries that are already experiencing the climate crisis. Anthony will speak a lot more to it. Next slide, please. So why does this matter for everyone? Literally, it's totally understandable. So much is going on domestically. People aren't able to eat. People are, SNAP benefits are being cut off. Soldiers are in the streets. And it's an unbelievably challenging time. Who are these people to be flying all over the world, burning more emissions just to sit around and have talks that don't add up to stuff? And that's completely legitimate. And we need to be at this table and forwarding these conversations. Our people are under threat more and more. The world continues to face these challenges. And we saw the hurricane devastation in Jamaica. Those in the global South, we are experiencing this now, and as meaning the diaspora, the African diaspora, the diaspora of peoples are experiencing this now, and in particular, as Americans, we have a responsibility to show up, to push for solutions, to push for the U.S. to be better. And we're in a position to prove out these solutions and continue to push for them. So, for us to be there, to be putting pressure on, to reminding folks about not only our communities here who face these challenges, but standing up for those around the world and demanding that we create these solutions. We're not in a position, I think, to stop doing that. And we need to continue to involve our young people and show them that there is a process and there is science and there are things for them to tap into, because of course this is their future. And so I just want folks to feel like we're not in a position to give up. Instead, we're in a position to do more to connect all of us on the ground, to have voices into this process, to send more of our local youth, to these events, and to be even more connected amidst all these challenges. Next slide, please. I believe that was it. And I will pass this on to Anthony. And actually, what I should have done, oh dear, and it might take me a moment because Nia, Anthony needs an introduction. Let
Yeah.
me let me see. Forgive me, Anthony. I want to pull up your bio.
Oh no, it's all good. I mean, you can. We've been in formation long enough. You can go off the dome.
I know. You sent me a bio and it was good. So I'm so sorry. I should have had that teed up, and I'm not sure if I did. Nia, do you happen to have Anthony's bio?
I will send it to you on just because I'm sharing my screen, I'll do it on my send it.
Okay. Well, but Anthony's right. I can, of course, go off the dome. Um, Anthony Rogers Wright is a tremendous movement leader, and I like to say movement intellectual and world citizen who has been involved. He was on the steering committee of the New York Renews Coalition, was the director of environmental justice for the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, and now is just a part of myriad coalitions, including the Black Alliance for Peace and the Movement for Black Lives, that are that are moving important things at COP and also a multitude of other spaces. And really, when it comes to these things, he's the most brilliant person I know. And he also has been digging in really deep on how traveling throughout the African diaspora, several countries in Africa, and throughout the diaspora in North America, South America, and throughout the world, to really focus on the need to bring our issues, in particular, to this COP. So I hope that was good enough.
Oh my gosh, amazing. Public
I
intelligence in
will.
a era. I just want to say it's such always an honor to share space with you virtually, but even it's going to be even more fun to see you in 3D in a week or so. What's also left out is that, Ryan and I have been in the trenches for some time. And since the theme of this is talking about sort of going from local to global, I was very honored to work with Raya on some of the most ambitious legislation ever. While he's going to be enjoying political retirement, we do thank former Governor Cuomo for passing the most ambitious climate law in the country, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which Raya was very instrumental in, and then even more on the local level, of course, which we are hoping to see realized now with this change in municipal administration in New York City. Local Law 97, the most aggressive building decarbonization legislation in the country. We're happy to have a mayor now that looks like it's going to implement it, because policy is only as good as they are implemented. And then something that's not getting enough, I think, copy or coverage, I should say, which is the landmark Renewable Rikers Act, which calls for next year the closure of the torture chamber known as Rikers Island and its transition to a 100% renewable energy hub. Worked with Raya closely on that during our time at New York Renews. And the thing about, sort of going from local to state to global, we kind of saw this happen when the CLCPA, Climate Leadership Community and Protection Act, eventually was utilized to become parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, although not a full mirror image of it. There were some elements missing in the Inflation Reduction Act that certainly were not included in the CLCPA. So just an honor. And now I, of course, work with Raya. She, along with Naira, who's on this call, are our policy leads in our blessed Black Hive, which is basically the climate and environmental justice arm, maybe climate and environmental liberation arm of Movement for Black Lives. So the other thing that I, wanted to say about grassroots organizations like Raya's and many others for people who I see are represented, is just to think about this. Voices who are centered are a function of struggles and issues that are centered. Here we are going to COP30 to the nation with the largest amount of African people outside of the African continent, in the continent with the largest number of African people outside of the continent. And it is unfortunate that groups like Raya's and voices like Miss Vernita, is on this call, have not been approached as of yet. But we are certainly going to do our very best to change that when we get to Brazil. So all right, so this, here's the schedule of events. We're going to talk about what we are anticipating to be the top themes at this year's climate conference in Brazil. The pictures that that Raya depicted and showed to you all will be what's happening in the blue zone. So this is, as Raya noted, where all the negotiations, all the capitulations, unfortunately, occur. And then we're going to talk about the importance of Afro-descendant self-determination and agency. We are making some critical interventions at this year's COP, given where it's located, under the leadership largely of the first Black woman vice president of the Bolivarian Republic of Colombia, the great Francia Marquez, who has really been leading on this work, building off to this theme of local to global, the landmark Colombia Law 70, which is the first bill that I know in the world that repatriates land back to Afro-descendant people who are mainly situated and dispersed along the Pacific coast of Colombia. As Raya named, we got to talk about the Paris Agreement, because we're not in a great place. And then we'll finish it off with some Q&A and some discussion about opportunities for building global grassroots solidarity. I don't have any pictures, but the other thing, to Raya's point about naming that, we'll go ahead and call Raya Brazil a petro-light state, but certainly not in the same vein as Egypt, as the Dubai and Baku, which are all petro states. Like, this is how they make their money. The other thing is that for the past 3 years, we have not been able to have a space outside of the blue zone where we could come together and have, if you will, a counter COP where we share ideas, we do panels. This is the first year that we're going to have that in 3 years. So we're very excited about that. And that's going to be the green zone where you don't necessarily need a badge. So we'll talk about that, maybe hear some of your ideas of what we can take with us. So we can go to the next slide. So the COP30 anticipated top themes, okay? Climate finance, which is messy, and we'll get into that more. This idea of mitigation and adaptation, messier still. Nation state accountability, as Ryan noted, nationally determined contributions, or what nation states are going to do to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Very messy, but we have a secret weapon this year that we are definitely hoping is going to be lifted up even more, and I'll get to that. We'll talk a little bit about just transition. I think what I really just want to say about that is that we know, as climate and environmental justice practitioners, as I like to call ourselves, that we have a very interesting relationship with labor. Sometimes labor can be, for those of you who are Black, that uncle you only see at Thanksgiving or at certain cookouts. But it's still a very dialectical relationship, because on the one hand, we're asking labor, in some instances, workers, to give up some very, very good salaries that are leading to the destruction of the planet. Someone to mute, please. Thank you. And we do have to talk about that relationship, right? Like pipe fitters, and now we're seeing the same thing with even data centers, because these are good jobs, and we have to be very intentional about that. Even with the term just transition, which for some workers induces a Pavlovian reaction that they don't like. And then we'll get into the very big importance of Afro-descendant agency and self-determination. We are going down hard and unapologetically Black and African this year, in solidarity, as I noted, with Brazilians and other South Americans, Caribbean island nations, and then, of course, African nation state representatives who will be there. Right, next slide. Okay, climate finance. I'm going to try not to nerd out about this, but as Ryan noted, at the last COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, nation states agreed on two climate finance targets for 2035, 300 billion per year from developed to developing countries, and 1.3 trillion in total climate finance flows. That doesn't even sound like money that's real, but this is what they agreed with. Um, Level of required global investment to address. So I wanted to put that into perspective, though. The estimated amount of money to actually address the climate crisis at scale, or at requisite scale would be more accurate, is approximately 5 trillion to 9 trillion dollars annually. Again, these don't even sound like real numbers, through 2030, and then up to 10 trillion dollars annually by 2050. Global finance reached an estimated 1.9 trillion in 2023 and has been going down ever since. And here's just a quote from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. These are, developed nations and their little club of economists. Noted that achieving our collective environmental goals, combating climate change, building sustainable, resilient communities, etc., the window to reduce global emissions by 45% by 2030 has become vanishingly small. I'm going to go ahead and say that because this quote was from 2023, we can go ahead and say that global emissions being reduced by 45% in the next 4 years is simply not going to happen. So, if we can go to the next slide. This brings us to the idea of what else is going to be discussed: mitigation and adaptation. These can be very, very triggering words for some people, especially many in non-African indigenous networks. Raya, myself, and others work with an incredible group called Indigenous Environmental Network, who are very dogmatic with their vernacular, and words like these make them cringe a bit, and I'll explain why. Let's talk first about the difference between mitigation and adaptation. The quote: "We must avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable." Right. That kind of makes sense. We like to say at Movement for Black Lives that we like to be honest and also radically pragmatic. And the bottom line is, because of massive damage to the atmosphere, where over 430, I believe, parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalents in the atmosphere, where we really need to be at 300 to 350, hence the name of the organization 350.org, when we're, well above that. So mitigation then is thought of making the impacts of the climate crisis or climate change less severe by preventing or reducing the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We're going to get back to that because that is triggering, right? Adaptation, on the other hand, we do have to anticipate, what's going to happen, what's been happening, and that could be anything from, building larger seawalls to building a levee system that actually works, right? In the Netherlands, they have a levee system that protects against 1 in 10,000 year events. When I was in the Netherlands and I asked what happens after a 1 in 10,000 year event, the Dutch engineer just kind of looked at me and said, "Look into the sky and look for the four horsemen, because that's it," and start praying. But those are examples of adaptation. But these things can also be co-opted, right? These are not innocuous terms and have massive implications for environmental justice communities globally, as well as the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, which is something that we utilize, especially when talking about indigenous communities across the planet, right? Whether they're indigenous to Turtle Island or indigenous to Africa, Asia, etc. I like to joke around it a lot and say there are indigenous people in Africa. They are called Africans, as a matter of fact. But again, mitigation, adaptation, not innocuous terms, and they must be used intentionally, or in some cases, they can actually cause more harm. Next slide. Mitigation and false. Yeah, we can stop here. Mitigation. No, no, no. We can go to the next one. That's fine. Mitigation and false solutions. Okay, this is what we mean by false solutions, or what I like to call green unicorns. There's this idea of net zero, and we're hearing more and more scientists reject that idea as a form of mitigation because it essentially says we can keep emitting as long as we find a way to sequester what we emit and balance it out. That doesn't work when what we really need to do is stop emitting and figure out a way to clean up our atmosphere from what's already in there. If you think of the atmosphere like a bathtub with a faucet and a drain, right? The bathtub is where all the emissions are captured, in this case, the atmosphere. The faucet are the actual emissions, what we're spewing up into the air. And then the drain is how we get those emissions dissipated or sequestered. Previously, we had lots of forest cover. We had agricultural practices that allowed soil to naturally sequester emissions. But as we have got into this era of massive deforestation, industrial agriculture, paving more surfaces, that drain is clogged. So what we basically have is a bathtub that is overflowing. So that's why net zero doesn't work. But there's ideas of like, oh, what else can we do to mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis? CCS, also known as carbon capture and sequestration, as also known as carbon capture utilization and storage. This is the idea that we can keep emitting and we will capture these emissions, ship them somewhere else, and store them underground and into a place where they will be safe forever. There have been many, many instances where this simply doesn't work. It's not that carbon capture sequestration is a false solution per se. It's just a demonstrably ineffective mechanism. The largest CCS plant in Australia, called Gorgona of all things, actually released 50% more emissions than it captured. And then we also know that 85%, 85 to 90% of so-called captured emissions is used for a technology or a process known as EOR, or enhanced oil recovery, where those emissions are shot underneath the ground to rupture, the substructure to release more oil and gas. Hence why I like to actually call it carbon catch and release, because it's just not effective. And the fossil fuel industry just loves it. A good friend of mine, Kate Arnoff, as a matter of fact, wrote an article for the New Republic. When the presentation ends, I'll try to find it and put in the thread. And the title of the piece was, "Why is the fossil fuel industry big fans of the Inflation Reduction Act, this historic climate bill?" It's because they are going to get so much money for using this technology. I believe like $85 to $150 per metric ton. Okay, this brings up contradictions because right now, as the Trump administration's I like to call them the Environmental Petroleum Agency, but previously the Environmental Protection Agency, want to stop reporting greenhouse gas emissions. The oil and gas industry are the biggest opponents against it, and they are actually working with Democrats to get EPA to not do that, but not for great reasons. They want that to stay in place so that they can keep making money off of CCS and keeping a status quo of emitting. Hydrogen combustion is another idea of mitigating the climate crisis through a new energy source. But again, one of the things that we always said when I was with the Climate Justice Alliance, is we always have to ask ourselves, what else will this impact? Hydrogen uses a lot of energy, uses a lot of water, and is not going to, it may mitigate one problem, but lead to another problem. So maybe out of the frying pan of fossil fuels and into the fire of massive water usage, more droughts, et cetera, et cetera. And then, geoengineering, this is something that is so bad that I actually had a meeting about a month ago with none other than Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. Yes, that Marjorie Taylor Greene, because geoengineering includes things like literally blocking the sun or cloud seeding. Marjorie Taylor Greene, through solar radiation management, which is basically blocking the sun to cool the planet because it's getting so much hotter, she introduced a bill to basically ban it outright, and actually had criminal prosecution for people who do geoengineering projects in the United States and its colonies or territories. So that one is so bad that even Marjorie Taylor Greene was like, "This is ridiculous." And then finally, this idea of new nuclear. This is tough, right? I mean, even people who I have a lot of love and support for, same as Raya, our dear brother Jamal Bowman, who we hope to see again soon, and the mayor-elect of New York City, Zohar Mamdani, are all pro-nuclear. The issue with that is, yes, it does not emit, but it certainly requires a lot more extraction of critical minerals, specifically on sovereign indigenous territory. Where is this waste going to go? And it's very expensive and it takes far too long to bring online. In this advent of data centers, older nuclear power plants are being brought back online, but we don't consider this an effective mitigation strategy, especially when truly renewable energy sources, wind, solar, and in some cases geothermal, are the cheapest ways to produce and distribute energy. All right, next slide. So that brings us to this idea of adaptation. The question is adaptation or maladaptation? There's a big difference, and we'll see why in the next slide, please. There's lots of concerns with the concept of adaptation. For some, including many of our indigenous partners and siblings and comrades, they view it as a form of surrender that diverts resources and attention from the root causes of climate change, which we at the Black Hive and Emperor BL and Black Alliance for Peace, we say the root causes of the climate crisis are white supremacy ideology, patriarchy, and colonization, right? All of these other things are symptoms of the larger diseases of those root causes vis-a-vis capitalism. So if we just surrender, but we're not going to focus on stopping the harm, that's that's adapting to a really, really bad situation instead of mollifying it, if not dismantling it altogether. Another concern is that the idea of adaptation implies a false sense of security, right? The problem can be managed. We can continue doing the status quo, just build higher seawalls, just build better levees. The earth is robust enough and we're going to be okay. That is not the case for places like Jamaica, the Revolutionary Republic of Haiti, the Revolutionary Republic of Cuba. That's just not the case. Right now, our siblings in Jamaica are making pleas to please just send water because all of their water systems have been contaminated with salt and seawater due to the sea surge caused by the recent hurricane. Third, the concept can be used to delay or avoid, necessary mitigation efforts. We talked about mitigation, but again, if we keep saying that we can adapt, okay, then again, it takes our attention away from what's happening and what's causing all of this harm in the first place. And then finally, the concept to some lacks clear definition or pathways for implementation, and poorly planned adaptation can make situations worse. What else will this impact? So when we're talking about this in the concept of COP30, what we also have to understand is that these global climate conferences, we're not alone, right? It's not just climate justice advocates. It's not just people who are going to fight the good fight. Last year in Azerbaijan, there was a ratio of 3-to-1 fossil fuel industry people, or attendees, than people who were there as civil society organizations and even lawmakers. It's not a coincidence that a week before we are heading to Brazil, just today, fossil fuel leaders held their conference in Abu Dhabi, OPEC, and they came to the decision that the era of the energy transition is over, which they refer to as music to our ears. And here's what the spokesperson for OPEC, who will definitely I always forget what OPEC stands for, but they're the oil and gas cartels who produce the most oil and gas in the world collectively. But what they basically said that this is a big shift in the way industry leaders and policymakers are now talking about meeting rising global energy demand. As Al Gais, who is their spokesperson, OPEC spokesperson, noted, quote, 3 years ago, it was all about energy transition, climate change to get rid of fossil fuels. Today, it's about how we have to have a balanced approach. So when we're talking about adaptation through the lens of fossil fuel cartels, this is what we're getting. Like they just want to keep the status quo and make us believe that we can adapt. And they do have way more power than they and more of a presence than they probably should in a global climate conference. Next slide, please. So the other Raya talked about this idea of nation state accountability through national determined contributions. They are central to the Paris Agreement, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, to achieving long-term goals, the Paris Agreement's long-term goals of reducing emissions and keeping the Earth without warming any more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we know is like going to happen very, very soon. We are in what's known as NDC 3.0. This is the third generation of countries' climate action plans or their nationally determined contributions, which are due this year. Their updated plans expected to be more ambitious than previous ones, incorporating lessons from the global stock take of basically like what's producing and all the emissions that are heating the planet that were agreed to in Paris in 2021. And wait, 2021? No, 2015. Oh my goodness. To put the world on a more sustainable path towards 1.5. We are nowhere close to where we need to be. Absolutely nowhere close. However, the secret weapon that I was talking about earlier is I think, a very salient and profound ruling, an opinion from the International Court of Justice. This is the UN's principal judicial body. How effective it is up for debates, right? I mean, we have some things going around in the world right now that the ICJ has also ruled on and has not been able to stop nonetheless. But still, this ruling and advisory opinion does still serve as great propaganda that we should certainly be taking with us to COP. And basically, they said that nation states have an obligation to protect the environment from greenhouse gas emissions, act with diligence and cooperation to fulfill the obligation. And the court further ruled if states breach these obligations, they incur legal responsibility. I don't know exactly what that means, but and may be required to cease the wrongful conduct. Also, we don't know what that actually means, and offer guarantees, of non-repetition. In other words, stopping the behavior and make full reparations. Reparations, y'all, like this is a very, very key word. We are going to be talking in COP about climate reparations, what we believe that global North nation states, of course, owe to the global South, or what I like to refer to as intentionally underdeveloped nations. Next slide. So this is just a depiction of those nation states that have submitted NDCs. Surprise, surprise, we are one of them. But all in all, they still account for only 36% of global emissions. The nation states that have no new NDCs account for about 64% of global emissions. Now, we have to be careful because we do see like a lot of those nations are in Africa. These are not the countries that are causing like the climate crisis, right? And China is also a bit of an outlier. China, of course, is on a track to hit peak emissions by 2032, and then they expect their emissions to go down even more every year after that. And of course, China is the leading nation in green technology, produce the most solar panels, the most wind turbines. So while this is a good depiction, you can go learn more. I'm going to make sure that this slide deck is sent around to everyone, as I promised Raya and Nia, so you can check it out on that website. It may actually even be updated by next week because nation states, of course, want to look like they're good stewards to the environment when they get to Brazil to fend off those pesky protesters. Next slide. That brings us to the reality of the climate agreement. Before I get into all of that, it was just yesterday that Politico came out with an article, and the headline is, according to the United Nations, nations are well off track of Paris Climate Agreement goals. And the US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement would actually erase a tenth of a degree Celsius of progress globally, right? That might seem like a small number, but globally, that's a lot. Okay. And speaking of NDCs, according to the report, new national plans designed to more aggressively combat climate change would hardly dent already dangerously high global temperature projections. And the findings also underscore the task at hand for all of us when we head down to Brazil in a week. The negotiations begin officially on November 10th, but the UN report showed nations are on a path that would bake in long-term changes to the planet, such as more deadly heat waves, runaway sea level rise, and likelier extreme events like wildfires and droughts. So, as we're going through Paris, we have to quote the great Dr. James Hansen. He's a very colorful fellow, and certainly never at a loss for words. He's basically literally said it's BS. I don't want to curse on Raya's recording, so we'll just you can just read it. But he's saying that like we're gonna exceed 2 degrees. These tipping points are going to happen, and I would add that the U.S. is leading, but right now we've also learned that the US, for instance, is bullying nations from taking aggressive action on climate, specifically in the shipping industry. The Trump administration has gone out of its way to threaten tariffs. We'll see if he'll still be able to do that. We're hearing some interesting things out of Washington regarding a Supreme Court case on the issue of tariffs now, where apparently quote unquote conservative judges are very skeptical about the ability of the constitutional right of the president to do this. But in the meantime, nations in the European Union and other nations have pulled back on reducing emissions from shipping because of the United States threats. So we'll have to see. But like at the bottom line is the People's Republic of China is going to be a very, very, very big story at COP30 because of what they're producing, the scale at what they're producing it, and how they plan on distributing all of this green technology. Next slide. Okay, yeah, yeah, this was basically a picture of the headlines. I've written a piece, I'll send it to Raya, called "The Paris Agreement is the Global Climate Movement's Two-State Solution," in that it's dead. And this is one of the things we'll be talking about a lot, in the Green Zone, in the People Summit, which will be taking place outside of the COP, of like, is this really our North Star when it comes to global emissions reductions? And how does this ICJ, International Court of Justice ruling, help us in actually forcing nations to do what, Paris is not legally binding per se. So there's no penalties for not meeting your climate goals. And as we've seen with the Trump administration, you can go and come as you please. If there's another administration, theoretically in 2028, they could very well say, okay, we're going to come back to Paris, the Paris Agreement, but that still doesn't necessarily put us on the pathway that we need, and certainly not at the requisite scale. Next slide. Yes. Okay. So this brings us to the very important subject of Afro-descended COP30 power moves. As I noted, we're going down hard. As we know, as I noted earlier, nearly 1 in 4 people in Latin America identify as Afro-descendant in forest areas stretching from Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador. Beautiful, not so pristine, but anymore because of oil and gas development, but beautiful, beautiful areas, beautiful, beautiful Black communities. I go down to them for a month every December, and it's one of my favorite parts of the year, clearly. In 2024, this was at the COP16, the biodiversity COP that took place in Santiago de Cali in Colombia. Like decades of collective organizing, research, advocacy, etc., territorial Afro-descendants, as well as Afro-descendant communities in Brazil, did celebrate a milestone at COP16. For the first time, global leaders did reach a historic agreement that basically recognized Afro-descendant communities as quote unquote have an important role in conservation, and they pledged to establish a body that would include Afro-descendants, indigenous peoples, and local communities. That's really what we're going to be fighting for at this year's COP, to make that official, right? We're going to go to that pledge and make it accountable and say to the UN, we want an official body that would give Afro-descendants all kinds of agency in decision making and the ability to get resources, financial and otherwise. Next slide. And this is just from the Global Afro-Descendant Climate Change Collaborative. This is if you will, you can call it a manifesto, but it's basically what they're going to be presenting to the UNFCCC the organization that Raya lifted up in her introduction. I won't get into like all of it, but essentially, they make their case and essentially are saying, therefore, we declare that we want this body to actually become official. So I think we have one more slide and show you an example of what that looks like. I mentioned Colombia Law 70 of 1993 is when it was passed, but it has finally been actually implemented. Like all the mechanisms have been put in place thanks to the leadership of the great Francia Marquez, Vice President of Colombia. I do want to read Article 1 verbatim because it just gives me shivers and it makes me feel really, really good as a Black man and as a Earth citizen in general. But the object of the present law is to recognize the rights of the Black communities that have been living on barren lands in rural areas along the rivers of the Pacific Basin in accordance with their traditional production practices to their collective property as specified and instructed in the articles that follow. Similarly, the purpose of the law is to establish mechanisms for protecting the cultural integrity and rights of the Black communities of Colombia as an ethnic group and to foster their economic and social development in order to guarantee that these communities have real equal opportunities before the rest of the Colombian society. I love that so much. So that's an example of, how we're going to be making our case. And I think we have one more slide where it's just basically questions and answers. But I do want to leave you with this closing thought from one of my mentors, the great Glenn Ford. We are seeing all kinds of contradictions starting to surface, especially with artificial intelligence and data centers. Where walls that used to separate working class people by race and ethnicity and experiences are starting to get like a little bit more opaque because more and more people are starting to feel these impacts and asking questions about why it's happening, regardless of who they voted for or what their current political ideology is. And what Brother Glenn said was when the narrative at the heart of a system of rule falls apart, when the flow of history runs counter to the story told by those in power, then we know the entire edifice is crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. The political crisis arrives when the people sense that the prevailing order is built on a foundation of oppression and lies. The rulers panic, scrambling to reweave the matrix of fables and myths that justify their waning supremacy. At such points in history, the truth is up for grabs and a change of regime is in the offing.